So take our Bibles and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 13. This is the next step in our study on the life. Let me pull this out here a little bit. The different characters in the Old Testament, 1 Samuel chapter 13. And we're talking about Jonathan. Question, here's a question for everybody but Karen, because Karen already knows the answer. How many Jonathans are there in the Bible? You get a special prize if you guess the right answer. How many Jonathans are mentioned in the Bible? How many different Jonathans? Somebody guess.
One.
Yes?
Three.
You said one. Okay. Nope. Higher?
7.
7. Higher. 12. Lower.
9.
Higher.
10.
Yes!
All right.
You win. 10. Ding, 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 ding. You get a free glass of water, brother. Or better yet, you get to come to the meeting for the day camp workers. And all right. And 10 of them, okay? But only 2 are really significant. The other 8 were significant probably to their mother in other ways. But I mean, as far as well known, the first was a grandson to Moses who got involved in idol worship in Dan. That not a really a positive situation. The Judges 18 verses 3 and 4 and verse 30. And then you have the Jonathan we're going to be talking about tonight, who is the son of whom? Saul. Okay, so we put this little square up here. Lessons from Jonathan, son of a faithless father. And you've heard the expression before, have you not? Here, what we have heard is not always what we see happen. For example, you've heard this, a chip off the old block. You've heard that before, right? That expression. And you've heard the expression, the apple does not fall far from the tree. And you've heard the expression, like father, like whom? Like son. Now these phrases are often true, and sometimes they're true in a very positive way, and sometimes they're true in a not so positive way, but sometimes they're not true. Now I just say this to encourage people, if they happen to have a heritage that is not envious, spiritually speaking, they have a heritage that has been really not what, looking back, they wish it was, you're not locked in to having to repeat it. Okay? You don't have to repeat the same mistakes your parents made. Because all parents make mistakes, okay? And so Jonathan is an example of a man who, even though his father made some very unwise choices, he made some very godly choices. And so we entitled Jonathan's study, When God Does What You Do Not Expect, okay? Now, you know the story that God brought Saul as king, the first king of Israel. Now, why was he made king? Why did God give them a king? They asked for one. They wanted to be just like the other nations around them, okay? And so God gave them a king, King Saul. And, of course, his oldest son was named whom? Jonathan, okay? So the idea was Jonathan was supposed to be the next in line. I guess how it worked. But Jonathan learned, and he had the battle between 2 things. And write this down if you're taking notes. And brother, after this, Brother Jimmy, you can take over from here if you don't mind. The battle between the given and the not given is seen and won in the life of Jonathan. Remember last Sunday morning we talked about the given and the not given? How we all have to deal with what God gives us, and we all have to deal with what God does not give us. We all have to deal with the fact that there are times that God does not give us what we wish he had given us, and there are times he gives us that which we wish we had not been given, okay? And everybody has to handle that. And the challenge in the Christian life is to accept the given and leave the not given alone, okay? I remember one time I was asked to consider, this has been a very long time ago, a particular church, the pastor, and I was talking to one of the main men in the church, and he made a frightening comment. And the comment was, well, we had to do something. That's a frightening comment. Okay, when you say you've got to do something, now I'm not talking about, okay, well, there's a fire in the house. Well, yeah, you got to do something. There are times like that, but in this case, it wasn't like that kind of situation. What he was saying was, we're to take matters in our own hand and do a certain thing. We have to understand that the not given of God is just as valuable to accept as the given. And many times we struggle with embracing the given because of what we don't have, okay? And that's probably true for all of us, I would think, okay? And in Jonathan's life, he went through this. Now, as I looked at his life, I thought how to do this in one message about his life. And what I've done is I've come up with three observations about the given heart. Now, in your outline, the given heart is a heart that accepts what is given. That's the meaning of that. That's why I have in quotations, okay? So the first one is this. Number one, the character of the given heart. I want to talk to you a moment about Jonathan's character and how it displayed itself in his life, okay? Look at 1 Samuel chapter 13. Look at verse 1. Saul reigned 1 year, and when he had reigned 2 years over Israel, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel. Now, you need to stop here to say this. The timing here has two ways of interpreting the timing. One is that it's simply a mistranslation. That's one that it's because the references to time was difficult in the Hebrew language. And the other approach is to understand him picking out two different points of time in Saul's life, not chronologically, but just as points of references. Because the timing in Samuel is not as clear as it might be from event to event. How much time transpired, we're just not sure. But at some point here, that he has these 3,000 soldiers, okay? Whereas 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash, which was near his hometown, and in Mount Bethel, 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gilbeth of Benjamin, and the rest of the people he sent every man to his tent. So in those days, it was very common, as in our country's day in the early years, to have a standing army of a limited quantity. And then, because a standing army is very expensive, you have to feed a standing army, you have to take care of it. So they would have a minimal standing army, and then they would, when need be, call up the reserves, okay, or call up others, as they will do in this storyline here, okay? And you have to understand this situation, again, more like you might understand Afghanistan at this point with the, it's not in the news now because of everything else, but when it was in the news, they had all these tribal groups, and you'd have this tribe rise up and this tribe go up, and in the 2001 and so forth, all these different tribes were really exerting themselves, and in this land here, you don't have like Europe, like here is France, and here is Germany, and so forth. It's more like the tribal situation, and one tribe would often, there were enemies, it's not worth fighting them until it gets to a point where there's a conflict. So these two groups might not be that far away geographically, and they may be from Nag's Head to Southern Shores, or Nag's Head to Kerala in distance, okay, and which in those days was a lot longer than it is when you can travel 50 miles an hour, drive up there or whatever, not in the summertime, obviously, but other times. And so you would have these groups, and things would happen, and they would have a conflict. Now look at verse 3. And Jonathan then smote the garrison. Now the garrison would have been the outpost of the Philistines that was at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard say that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and that Israel also had in the abomination with the Philistines, and the people were called together after Saul in Gilgal. Now, in this is the first time Jonathan appears on the scene. He appears as an adult. He has responsibility, and he makes the decision, and he attacks this garrison, okay? And it would seem like he, as from the context, that he was victorious here, but now it begins a cascade effect, where now Saul calls up the other people to come, and they're going to have a conflict here. But here's the thing you see in these verses, that letter A, he had duty without recognition. That though Jonathan did the work in verse 3, led the conflict, his father got the credit for it, as it were, in verse 4. So you have to understand that in his position, you see this attitude play out in his life, where he does not have to have the recognition in order to do his duty. Now, as the story unfolds, Saul goes to sacrifice, and he goes to make the sacrifice before the Lord. Look at verse 7. And some of the Hebrews went over to Jordan, to the land of Gad and Gilgad. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. And he tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. So he waited for Samuel to come, and he was going to do a sacrifice, and he was going to get that spiritual affirmation of his effort to sort of calm the people down. King Saul knew that the people were uneasy, and he needed this spiritual affirmation of the man of God for what he was doing. But he becomes impatient, and he won't wait for the prophet of God. And he steps outside of what he had done, okay? In verse 9, okay, after waiting, in verse 9 he says, and Saul said, bring hither the burnt offering to me and the peace offering, and he offered the burnt offering. So he makes a huge blunder there. He does this. And then in verse 11 says, and Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul, because I saw the people were scattered from me, and that thou comest not within the days appointed. See, he's afraid because of the politics. The people were drifting away. He was afraid of the allegiance there, and the Philistines were gathered together. Verse 12, therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me in Gilgal. So he's afraid for his life and his stability. Okay, look at verse 13. And Samuel said to Saul, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now would the Lord have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever. But now thy kingdom shall not continue. The Lord hath sought him a man after his own heart. So here God pronounces to the king that your line will end with you. Okay? But notice what Jonathan does, okay? All right, how Jonathan responds here, okay? And verse 15, and Samuel arose and he goes forward and he numbers the people. And look at verse 16, and Saul and Jonathan his son and the people. So what does Jonathan do? Jonathan stays with his father, even though his father has made the ultimate blunder and lost the family heritage. So let it be. You see submission despite defects. You see submission. He is submissive to his father's role, even though his father had committed such a grievous act before God and has brought the chastening hand of God upon his family's heritage. Okay? And yet what does Jonathan do? Jonathan stays faithful and submissive to the authority in his life. Now, this is an important thing to understand. We see this in David's life, do we not? Later on, when Saul is chasing David, and David has a chance to kill Saul in the cave, and what does he do? He doesn't kill him. Why? Because he doesn't want to touch God's anointed. Because now watch this, you need to understand this, even a wrong leader, when the leader is in position of authority, is due the respect given to that position. Okay? We have to respect the person's position. We may not respect the personality, we may not agree with the actions, but there's a level of respect here of God's plan. And this man has submission despite that defect. Then, as the story unfolds in chapter 14, Jonathan comes back on the scene in a very proactive way. And it came to pass in verse 1 that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said unto the young man that was his arms, his armor bearer. Now, the armor bearer here is not simply like a valet or something. He was a man of stature, of valor, of ability to fight, because he was the protector of his man. And what's happening here is they're at a garrison, okay, just to summarize the story, an outpost from the main group, and they come upon him. The Philistines think that they are either deserters, they're deserters. So they welcome them to come in, okay, to their group. And there's about 20 of them, and Jonathan and his assistant, his armor bearer, are going to now wind up killing them, okay? But notice, if you would, look at verse 6 to understand the mindset that allowed this to happen. Verse 6, and Jonathan said unto the young man that bare his armor, come and let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. That's a reference of derision. Remember, David used that about Goliath, a reference to unbelievers. It was a synonym. As circumcision was a synonym for believers often, people who believed in Jehovah God, the uncircumcised was a reference to those who did not believe in Jehovah God. And it came that it may be that the Lord will work for us. Now watch this, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. That gives you an insight into his mindset, okay? Now, he was not a foolish man. He was a military leader. But he understood that God does not have to have a lot of stuff. We had a Next Step class today, and I went through the part of the slide presentation, Next Step class, about the history of the church. And when we started up in Currituck at the Palace Point Museum, before we started there, okay, we were meeting in homes for a couple of weeks and just praying about whether God would have us to do this. And I said to the people, I said, this is really difficult to do. You got to put up and you got to take down. You got to put up and you got to take down. It's very uncertain when you try to start it, and it is, okay, particularly when you had no money, okay. We had nothing. We had nothing. We had no backing. So you might hear me talk about, we'll go see if God wants us to do a youth pastor. You say, where is it in the budget? Where it's always been in the budget. I mean, I'm not saying what we should do. I mean, that's in the God's hands. But I remember, if you were with us when we voted, we bought this property here. We had a family conference, and we had the chance to buy the property. And we said, how many of y'all think we should buy the property? Well, everybody but one person raised their hand. And maybe the one person was the smart one in the group. I don't know, but only one person, everybody else raised their hand. And they said, okay, we're going to buy the property. And so the question came up, well, how are we going to buy the property? Because it was $120,000 down payment. And somebody asked me, how much of that do we have? I said, we don't have any of it. I said, but if we have it in 6 weeks, or 8 weeks, however long it was, then we know it's God's will, we buy it. So 8 weeks later, whatever it was, we had the money. And so we bought the property. Okay? Now, I'm not saying this that anybody else should do it. I'm not saying that means you should buy your own house, but that's how God led us to do it. Okay? And just step out. And if God is in it, okay, now God has to be in it. You can say, well, that's not very smart. That was a little foolish. Well, I don't doubt that makes sense to you. It is foolish. But I'm just saying that little as much when God is in it. And that's what we have here. Okay? What we have here is Jonathan says, God can save, God can provide through people who simply want to be used of him. Okay? We give him what you have, and God can accomplish what he wants to accomplish. Now, it's in his hands, okay? I just want to encourage you in your life. You think, well, I don't really have much to offer God, okay? I hear you're battling between the given and not given, and I wish I was over here doing this, but yet God has a reason for you. I told you before how, I did, growing up, I used to have this view of myself, and I joke about it now, but then I was sort of a quiet, introverted kind of guy, a guy that just was very, very much of a ponderer of thought. And I'm really not that way. I'm really my mind is pretty active. My mind moves all the time. But for what God has called me to do, for in counseling and other things, it really works well, okay? And so it works well. For other things, it would not work as well for. But God has made you the same way. God has made you for his call upon your life. The fact that you're not the way somebody else is doesn't mean you're defective. It simply means you're different. God's made you differently. You don't have that personality, okay? You don't have some people, you know there are some people who are really neat. Do you know that? I mean, they're really neat. Now, I'm not one of them, but there are people who are really, don't you love those people? I do. I see their stuff that's neat, and I think, oh, that's me when I'm dreaming, okay? I think that's great, okay? But, now not all of them, so if you're one of those people, I'm not talking about you, but sometimes it's a bit hard for people who are really organized to sort of ad-lib and roll with the punches. Now, again, not nobody here, I don't have anybody in mind, I'm just saying, but that's, every strength has sometimes a weakness to it, okay? So, what you got to do, like Jonathan, is say, you know what? God's power is enough despite human limitation. If I give it over to God and God wants to do it, let's let him do it. Now, again, I'm not suggesting you be, and Jonathan wasn't foolish. Jonathan, he was just getting a garrison. He didn't attack the whole army by himself. So he wasn't foolish about it, okay? And, but he had trust in the Lord. So that's the character of the given heart. Okay, number two, the commitment of the given heart. Okay, this heart that Jonathan had was a committed heart, and it was two ways committed. First of all, it was relationally committed. Okay, it's relational. Look at chapter 18. Okay, look at chapter 18. I love this about Jonathan. And look at chapter 18, verse 1. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And David and Jonathan's loved him as his own soul. You have here a relationship. You have and I know the sick world around us and the perverted world tries to pervert this relationship, as they have many historical relationships, but they were very proper relationship between two men trying to read stuff into it that is not there. Here you have just two men that really, Jonathan loved David. Now Jonathan knew, okay, what that meant. Jonathan knew that David was going to be king, but at some point, but he cared about him, okay? And verse 2, and Saul took him that day and would let him go no more to his home to his father. And Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garment, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. Now, remember back in the, when David was getting ready to go after Goliath? And you remember when David went before King Saul? And what did King Saul offer to David? His sword and his stuff. Now, why did Saul offer him his stuff? Do you remember? Do what?
I was going to guess.
Guess.
Like, to get credibility. So if David won, then it was like he's part of Saul.
There you go, exactly. It was a way of getting credibility. It was a way that to connect himself with the victory, okay, if it won. If it didn't lose, well, the kid didn't know what he was doing, okay? And sort of like, plausible deniability. Politics are always politics, okay? But, yeah, so that giving of that was a connection. But here, I believe, it's in a different way. I think Saul Jonathan as the heir apparent is giving his royal clothing to David as a sign of not trying to connect him to David, but trying to connect David with him and saying, you're the one. But you have this covenant love. You have this relationship. And here's the deal. A person that's going to be committed in his relationships has got to be a given kind of person. Here's what I mean by this, okay? There's a wonderful verse that is applicable to ministries. One of the pastors or men in ministry, or people in ministries, theme verses, And it ought to be the theme verse for people who have friendships that mean something to them. It's in Corinthians, when towards the end of 2 Corinthians, when Paul says, but the more I love you, the less I am loved. Remember that verse? Paul said to the Corinthians, the more I love you, the less I am loved. But I'm paraphrasing, but I still love you. See, he had a commitment in his relationships that were powerful. He accepted the relationships that he had, and he let go the relationships that were removed from him. Okay? A person who is a person that is accepting the given takes his relationships that God gives him. He said, these are the relationships. Now, the thing about relationships is this. They're messy, aren't they? They are messy because people are difficult. And if you don't believe they're difficult, ask somebody to explain how you are to them, because you're probably difficult, okay? Because we're all difficult. Now, you say, well, I'm not. Well, maybe you're the exception to everything the Bible says, but I don't think so. But we all are difficult. We all are sinners. And so I've got to be willing to say, okay, that if this is a given relationship to me, that I take it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. But I'm committed to it. That's why if you're married, then you say, well, I have a real problem in my marriage. Okay, well, fine, you have a problem. I'm so sorry you have a problem. Well, what do I do? Well, you solve the problem. That's what you do with it. You solve it. You have a problem, you solve it. But you say, well, what if I don't solve it? Well, then you live with it. Because there's only two options you have. You either solve it, you live with it, okay? Because you can't leave the marriage. It's not an option for you. You're there, okay? And so you say, well, that doesn't sound really nice, but that's how relationships are. Don't you realize that everybody gives people that they love and that loves them at times difficulties to deal with. But you got to be committed in a way that supersedes that, okay? And Jonathan's committed here to that relationship. But not only is he committed, relationally committed, he's also reliably committed. I hope I spelled that wrong. Reliably. Anyhow, write down reliably. Is that the right word? Reliable. Oh, commitment. Oh, we got a commitment on that. Okay, that's good. It says right. Okay. All right, turn to chapter 20. The way these PowerPoints get done is I make them up initially, and then I give them to her, and then she corrects the grammar on it if it's not quite right. So I guess it's right. Okay, sounds good. All right, number 2, reliable commitment, okay? In chapter 20, what you have here is Saul is really trying to kill David. Just really get him, okay? And they have a covenant that Jonathan and David has made, okay? And then they have a plan. And the plan is that Jonathan's going to go to the meal with the king, and if the king acts kindly about towards David, and he's going to check his dad out, and he thinks it's safe, then he's going to come out and shoot an arrow, and he's going to have a servant, and the servant's going to run after the arrow, and if he says to the servant, hey, come, the arrow is this way, okay, towards me, then that's a sign to David that the coast is clear and he can come, okay? If I say, no, the arrow's farther out, it's basically saying, David, don't show up because you're going to get killed, all right? So he makes this arrangement, okay, with him, okay? And then he follows through on it, okay? And in verse 41, and as soon as the lad was gone, David rose up out of the place toward the south and fell on his face to the ground and bowed himself 3 times, and they kissed one another and wept one another until David exceeded. And Jonathan said to David, go in peace. And they're heartbroken, and they know this is it. They are not going to see each other again. They are separated now, okay? And David is on the run, and now in chapter 22, he gets his 400 men, and then the rest is history, okay? But Jonathan is reliable. He has a reliable commitment to David. He, all the way up to the end of their interaction, he could be relied upon. And that kind of commitment is the commitment found in the given heart. That you're gonna show up. You're gonna be there. You're not gonna wimp out on the commitment. You're gonna stay there through the end. Okay. And then finally, number 3, this contentment, the contentment of the given heart. Okay. Look at you're in chapter 20. Look at verse 30. There's an exchange here between Saul and Jonathan. Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse, rebellious woman. That's the nice way to talk about his mother. Okay. I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse of thy own confusion and under the confusion of thy mother's nakedness. Look at verse 31. As long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. It's very clear what's going on here. That Saul says to Jonathan, look, if David lives, you're not going to be king. So a few verses later, what does Jonathan do? He makes sure that David gets out free safely. You know why? Because letter A, he is content with God's plan for others. He is content with God's plan for David. He is not going to alter that. He's going to accept it. A given heart accepts God's plan for others. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't always like God's plan for other people. Are you ever that way? That you wish things were different, okay? I'm glad, for example, that Jonathan's serving God in Korea. If he was just sending the 5 grandkids home for more often, that would, no, I'm just kidding. But we miss them. We miss them. We do. We wish we had more opportunity to be with them, okay? So, now, I don't want it to change. I want to be in God's will. So I want that, if he listens to this, Jonathan, don't come home. Okay, but I don't want him to change, but I do miss it. And yet, we have to be willing to accept and be content with God's will for others. But secondly, we have to be willing to be content with God's will for ourselves. Look all the way over to chapter 31. Chapter 31, and look at verse 2. And the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan. They have to understand that Jonathan wasn't dumb. He knew that God had cut the line of his dad off. Now, if you know that, and you're next in line, you can't be too worried about your retirement plan. You don't really know how it's going to play out. Yet he stays committed to God's will for his life as his father's son and stays by his side. To me, that's an amazing quality. To be content to accept the will of God, not only for others, but for yourself. And as we think about being men and women of the given, not the non-given, but the given, let us ask ourselves 3 questions. First of all, am I exhibiting the character in my life that is consistent with a given heart? Am I duty-bound? Am I submissive? And is God's power enough for me? Is my character that way? Am I committed in my relationships? Am I committed relationally and reliable to others? Can people rely upon me? And then finally, am I content with what God has for me? Now, you close your Bibles, look this way, we're going to land the plane. If you've lived longer than probably a junior in high school, then you probably have learned that life seldom works out in every way like you thought it would be. And the longer you live, the more that contrast comes into clearer focus. And if you're not careful, you can look at your life and you can start comparing it to others, what others have in their life or what you think they have. Or you can compare it to what you think you want to have or should have. But don't we have what God wants us to have? Isn't God in control? Isn't God at work in our lives? So let's try to be the children of the given and be at peace with that. And then one more thing. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you could be complacent. Remember that contentment and complacency are not synonyms. And true biblical contentment does not lead to complacency. It leads to quite the opposite. If I'm biblically contented, then I'm all in to whatever God has for me. That's what Jonathan was. I mean, Jonathan was content with God's will, but he fought alongside his dad. He still stayed there in his role as the king's son. He didn't abandon his father. All the way to the end, giving everything he had to the task at hand. So let's be content, not complacent. Let's be children of the given and not the non-given.